Sir John, thank you very much indeed for joining us. On the face of it, to be 13 points behind a block of wood called Sir Keir Starmer, it must be the crowning achievement of Boris Johnson's political career. How did it come to this?
Essentially, George, because since the beginning of November, the question of Boris Johnson's probity and more recently his honesty has become the dominant political question of the day, and a majority of the electorate, at least, including many a person who voted Conservative in 2019, have now come to have doubts about his probity and are certainly inclined to the view that he's not always been telling the truth about the various parties stroke gatherings that are alleged to have taken place during the course of lockdown. This story really begins with the attempt to try and avoid the suspension of Owen Paterson, the former Conservative MP for North Shropshire, who'd been upbraided by the Standards Committee for lobbying ministers on behalf of companies that he was being paid to as a consultant, and that's against the rules of the House of Commons. He tried to avoid him being suspended. There was an almighty row. 24 hours later, he did an about turn, but that began to raise questions about what Boris Johnson's judgment and about his ethics. And then, of course, we had now infamous video released on the 7th of December, which showed Allegra Stratton, his former spokesperson, struggling in a mock press conference to defend a gathering that supposedly took place in December 2020 when England was under fairly substantial lockdown. And that instigated what we might now call Partygate 1.0. By the end of which, by Christmas, support for the Conservatives was down to about 32 points, whereas before the Owen Paterson affair, they'd been back up at 40, and Labour were amongst those who profited. Well, it all went quiet over the Christmas season, inevitably, and indeed Conservative fortunes revived a little bit. But then earlier last week, ITV, and it's ITV on both occasions who've made the running, released an email in which there was an invitation to attend a party in 10 Downing Street in May 2020. It was rumoured that Boris Johnson had attended this. Indeed, then the Prime Minister was forced to admit that he had done on Wednesday. And that just basically has put the Conservatives back in even greater trouble electorally than they were at the end of Christmas. They're now running on average about 30% in the polls. And to top it all, following on from the email and the admission that there was a party in May 2020, there was what for the Conservative base, for loyal Conservative voters, is perhaps the worst of all of the various incidents that have come to light, which was the discovery that two parties were held at 10 Downing Street, not with the Prime Minister present, but in his office, two parties being held on the eve when the Queen was attending the funeral of her husband, the Duke of Edinburgh, and was having to socially isolate and therefore was on her own. And that, in a sense, I think for many a Conservative, has probably been the last straw.
Now, you're a knight of the realm, so I shan't ask you to follow me down this road, but hear me out. I have always known that Boris Johnson was a man with no probity. I've always known that he was a man that was thoroughly dishonest. I'll go further. Every journalist and broadcaster in the country already knew that. So what is new that has tipped this balance? Is it just last straw kind of thing?
No, I mean, I'll come back to your earlier remarks in a moment, George. The reason why it's now become an issue for the wider electorate is that whereas previously his tendency, and the way I would put it is that Boris is somebody who, focuses on trying to get done what he wants to have done, and is willing to be rather light in his adherence to rules and regulations and the law along the way. I mean, the most famous example of this was his prorogation of Parliament in September 2019. The UK Supreme Court said this was illegal, but that was fine for at least half the electorate because that was done in pursuit of Brexit. And the other incidents that we can raise, I mean, again, for example, the so-called VIP lane for people who were willing to provide the government with PPE during the pandemic. And, if you knew a Tory MP, you got on this fast list for consideration. Now, that's been ruled illegal by the courts. But again, many people would say that the end justified the means because all of us certainly wanted doctors and nurses to have the adequate PPE. The trouble with the last couple of months is that there isn't a body of voters out there who thinks that life should be made easy for MPs with respect to their second jobs. Indeed, many voters think they shouldn't have them, or at least no more than the odd doctor also filling in occasionally on an NHS ward. And certainly, as we knew from the Dominic Cummings affair, there is nobody out there who thinks that it's fine for people who are responsible for making the rules over COVID, very draconian rules at one stage that stopped people from attending relatives' funerals, from holding the hand of a relative that was dying, to be able to visit loved ones who with dementia in their care home. People have made really painful sacrifices, only then apparently to discover that 10 Downing Street carried on in a manner that seemingly seemed to think that the rules were never, ever there. And what therefore has happened, George, and I now come back to your earlier remarks, yes, I'm perfectly well aware that a lot of people have felt that in the past that the relationship between Boris Johnson and the truth seemed to be sometimes a rather loose one. But one of the things that is a fascinating set of Twitter comments from James Johnson, Theresa May's pollster, who's been holding focus groups amongst voters, including amongst Conservative voters. And he's released a whole string of quotes on Twitter this evening, in which basically what a lot of the voters were saying, well, look, we thought Boris Johnson was different. He seemed to speak our language, and he was getting Brexit done. So he was somebody who had got across to them and proved attractive to them. But now, those qualities that they once thought were attractive, they're now saying, hang on, he's a bit of a buffoon. He's a bit of a joke. We can't trust him. So, it does look as though, certainly now this is only a few people, it's qualitative research, but certainly, it's in tune with the quantitative polling data that perhaps indeed now there's a wider body of people who perhaps share the doubts that you've certainly expressed and certainly Boris Johnson's critics have expressed in the past. And if that is the case, then the problem facing the Prime Minister and the problem facing his party is whether or not, if indeed a significant section of the electorate, including many people who voted in 2019 for the Conservatives, have come to that conclusion, whether or not that is a change of impression that's capable of being reversed.
He's like a figure out of Tom Brown's school days. He's a shark. He's a mountebank. He fathers children in other people's marriages. He's a serial adulterer. He is a man that was dismissed by a national newspaper for dishonestly inventing quotations. He's famously loose, not just with morals, but with the truth. But he's a vote winner, Sir John. At least for the Tories, he's a vote winner.
Well, he was, undoubtedly. And look, he's a very highly charismatic figure. He's a very effective campaigner, a brilliant speaker, so long as he doesn't lose his notes. For those who believed in Brexit, having been the person who probably was, together with Nigel Farage, responsible for ensuring that the UK voted to leave the European Union, something with which I know you have a certain amount of sympathy, then the truth is, for that section of the British public, they really very much took to him. And, he didn't seem like your standard Tory toff, although, of course, many people will say that given he did Eton and Oxford, he was. But anyway, that's what he managed to achieve. The point is that now, for that very same group of people, however, they've now, as it were, many of them come to a very different conclusion, because they've now seen him fail to follow the rules and to do things differently over something which makes them at least deeply upset, and thus the change of tone. Now, you're asking about Sir Keir. Now, it's certainly true that the reason why the Labour Party are ahead in the polls is primarily because the Conservatives have scored these own goals, or more accurately, Boris Johnson has. And indeed, at least until the last few days, Labour's standing in the poll was no higher than it was 12 months ago. All we were looking at is the party recovering from a pretty dismal year in 2021. That said, I have to say to you, George, Labour are now running at 41. It's no great shakes, but it is their highest standing at any point in this parliament, their highest standing under Sir Keir. And I think I would say, and maybe you might even be willing to concede, I think one of the things that I've certainly noticed in recent weeks is that Sir Keir perhaps has begun a little bit to learn how to be a politician, and has become a little bit less of the lawyer. I mean, for a long time over Prime Minister's questions, he was spending his time trying to fillet the Prime Minister as though he was a prosecuting lawyer, which we all know he's very good at. Now, it's very effective, but it doesn't really come up with a broad message that comes out well in the 6 o'clock news, the 10 o'clock news. More recently, he has started to make much more rhetorical comments in Prime Minister's questions, making a political point. And I think that certainly has been more effective. And I think perhaps that's begun, and it's only with a very capital B, begun perhaps to persuade a few more people in the public that maybe he might be an effective Prime Minister, though the truth is even now, people are basically, for every person who thinks, yeah, maybe he'd be okay, there's another one who still has their doubts. The public is still largely very much indifferent to him, though, of course, I know that some people inside the Labour Party are not indifferent towards him, but shall we say the animus that some people inside the Labour Party feel towards Sir Keir is largely lacking amongst the public. They may not think he's up to very much, but few people dislike him or feel very strongly in favour of him in the way that was certainly true on both sides of the scale so far as Jeremy Corbyn was concerned.
Well, I suppose, and because of the time, it'll have to be my final question, but the big question, therefore, is can Boris Johnson come back from this? And if not, what do the Tories do next?
Well, it's certainly very, very difficult. I mean, previous Prime Ministers have been in trouble essentially because of arguments about policy. All of this has essentially happened because of arguments about Boris Johnson's behaviour. So it's very, very much about his personality. And the question the Conservative Party have to ask themselves is however effective a vote he was in the past, is he now damaged goods and therefore needs to be returned to sender? That's the question they have to ask themselves. If they do come to that conclusion, then the truth is I think they will find themselves having to get rid of him. And then we will be in a new political ballgame. We will have somebody, either Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss, who certainly I think will not be as willing to be as interventionist as Boris Johnson was. He isn't a traditional Tory, at least in certain respects. He's something of a big spender. And that, I think, might actually present the Labour Party with a rather easier target to attack. Labour Party would like politics to go back to an argument between right and left. Quite difficult to do that when your presumably right-wing opponents are led by a Prime Minister whose instincts are rather heavily on the interventionist side.
Very, very fascinating situation, and no one better to explain it than your good self. Professor Sir John Curtice, thanks for joining us.